The bitter wind rattled the cabin walls as Sophia Lawson pressed her daughter closer to her chest, desperate to transfer what little body warmth she had left. 6-month-old Emma slept fitfully beside the cold iron stove, wrapped in every blanket Sophia could spare. Wyoming Territory, 1878, a harsh winter for anyone, but especially for a widow with an infant and no fuel to last the night. Sophia's teeth chattered as she gazed down at her baby's face. Emma's cheeks were still pink, but for how long? The blizzard outside showed no signs of relenting, and the temperature inside the small cabin dropped with each passing hour. 3 days ago, her last log had been sacrificed to the stove's hungry maw. Now, as night fell across the prairie, Sophia began to wonder if they would survive until morning. A sharp knock at the door startled her so badly she nearly dropped the tin cup of water she'd been warming between her palms. No one ventured out in weather like this, no one sane, at least. "Who's there?" she called, her voice thin with fear. "Madam, name's Patrick Norris," came a deep, weather-roughened voice. "Got caught in the storm, saw your cabin. I'm freezing half to death out here." Sophia hesitated, one hand instinctively moving to the shotgun propped beside the door. Since losing her husband Thomas 6 months prior, just days before Emma's birth, she'd learned to be cautious. "I have a gun," she warned, "and I know how to use it." A dry chuckle drifted through the wooden door. "Reckon that's fair, madam. I ain't looking for trouble. Just shelter till this blizzard passes." Something in his tone, a weary honesty, made her decision. Sophia unlatched the door, shotgun still ready, and pulled it open. The man standing on her porch was tall, his broad shoulders dusted with snow. A cowboy, judging by his attire, though his clothes were nearly buried under layers of frost. His face, what she could see of it beneath his snow-crusted hat and the bandana pulled up around his nose, was lined with exhaustion. Behind him stood a horse, equally snow-covered and miserable-looking. "Thank you kindly," he said, stepping inside and stomping his boots. As he unwrapped the bandana, Sophia caught sight of a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble and eyes the color of a summer sky. He couldn't be much older than her own 23 years. His gaze traveled quickly around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, then landing on Emma's sleeping form beside the cold stove. His expression shifted. "Your baby's sleeping beside a cold stove," he observed, his brows drawing together in concern. Without waiting for a response, he began removing his gloves. "You'll have heat before sunrise, promise you that." Sophia lowered the shotgun slightly. "The wood's gone. I used the last of it days ago." Patrick Norris looked at her with an intensity that made her heart skip. "Madam, with respect, I've survived 3 Wyoming winters. I won't let a woman and child freeze on my watch." Before she could protest, he was back out the door, disappearing into the swirling snow. For several minutes, Sophia stood frozen in indecision, wondering if she'd just been abandoned or if the stranger truly meant to help. Then the door burst open again, and Patrick staggered in with his arms full of supplies from his saddlebags. "Horse is in your lean-to," he explained, dropping an assortment of items onto the table. "Got some jerky, coffee," and he pulled out a small flask, whiskey, medicinal purposes. "But what about the fire?" Sophia asked, watching as he moved with purpose around her small home. Patrick gave her a grim smile. "First things first." He knelt beside Emma, studying the sleeping child with gentle eyes. "How old?" 6 months, Sophia answered, surprised by the tenderness in his expression. Most men, especially unmarried cowboys, showed little interest in infants. "She's beautiful," he said simply, rising to his feet. "Now, about that heat." For the next hour, Sophia watched in amazement as Patrick transformed her situation. He disappeared repeatedly into the blizzard, returning with pieces of wood she'd never noticed parts of her lean-to that weren't structural. Fragments of an abandoned cart half buried in snow behind her cabin. Even dried cow dung he'd found preserved under the snow where her late husband's small cattle herd had once gathered. While Sophia held Emma, now awake and fussing from the cold, Patrick assembled his findings in the stove, working with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to survival. "It won't be pretty," he warned, "but it'll burn." When the first flames caught, Sophia felt tears spring to her eyes. Blessed heat began to radiate from the stove. Emma's tiny face turned toward the warmth like a flower seeking the sun. "I don't know how to thank you," Sophia whispered, bouncing her daughter gently. Patrick waved away her gratitude. "No need for thanks. Anyone would do the same." But Sophia knew better. In the 6 months since Thomas had died, leaving her alone with a newborn and a failing homestead, she'd learned the hard truth about anyone. Neighbors who lived miles away, busy with their own survival, had little to spare for a widow. The nearest town was a full day's ride, impossible with an infant in winter. "No," she said firmly. "Not anyone would ride through a blizzard, then give up their own supplies for strangers." A hint of color touched his weathered cheeks. "I was raised better than to leave folks to freeze." He busied himself with the fire, adding pieces methodically to build a lasting burn. "My ma would haunt me from the grave if I did." As the cabin slowly warmed, Sophia felt life returning to her numb fingers and toes. Emma had stopped fussing and now cooed softly in her arms. The immediate danger had passed, thanks to this cowboy who'd appeared like an answer to prayers she'd been too proud to utter. "Are you hungry?" she asked, suddenly aware of her duties as a hostess. Patrick looked up from the stove. "Don't trouble yourself on my account. It's no trouble. I have beans and some salt pork. It's the least I can do." While Patrick continued tending the fire, Sophia prepared a simple meal, Emma balanced on her hip. The domestic scene struck her with unexpected poignancy. For months, she'd eaten alone, speaking only to her daughter. Having another adult present, hearing a man's deep voice in her home again, made her realize how desperately lonely she'd been. "Where were you headed before the storm caught you?" she asked as they sat down to eat. Patrick blew on a spoonful of beans. "Rollins. Got work waiting at the Breckenridge Ranch. You're a long way off course," he nodded, a rueful smile tugging at his lips. "Storm blew in faster than I expected, lost the trail about noon, been riding blind for hours when I spotted your chimney." "Lucky for us," Sophia murmured. "Lucky for me too," he countered. "Another hour out there and you'd have found a frozen cowboy come spring thaw." After they'd eaten, Patrick insisted on taking the floor near the stove, refusing Sophia's offer of the bed. As she settled in with Emma beside her, Sophia studied their unexpected guest in the dim firelight. His face in repose looked younger, the worry lines smoothed away by exhaustion. She wondered about his story, where he'd come from, what he'd seen in his travels. The blizzard raged through the night, but the cabin remained warm. True to his word, Patrick rose several times to maintain the fire, his movements quiet so as not to disturb mother and child. When morning came, Sophia woke to find Emma already up, sitting contentedly in Patrick's lap while he fed her small spoonfuls of warmed milk. The domesticity of the scene caught her off guard, as did the surge of emotion it triggered. "She was fussing," Patrick explained quickly, looking almost embarrassed. "Didn't want to wake you." "You're good with her," Sophia observed, taking in the natural way he supported Emma's back. He shrugged. "Got 4 younger siblings back home in Missouri, helped raise them after Pa died." The storm had abated somewhat, though snow still fell steadily outside the frost-covered windows. Patrick moved to the door and opened it a crack, assessing the weather. "Looks to be letting up some," he said. "Should move on once it clears." An unexpected pang of disappointment shot through Sophia. "You're welcome to stay until the trails are passable. Could be days yet." Their eyes met across the small cabin, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared loneliness. "Wouldn't want to impose," Patrick said carefully. Sophia smiled, surprising herself with her boldness. "You saved our lives, Mr. Norris. I think we're past worrying about imposition." And so Patrick stayed as the blizzard of '78 continued for 3 more days. In that time, a routine developed between them. Patrick ventured out each morning to care for his horse and forage for more fuel, returning with rabbits or prairie hens he somehow managed to trap in the snow. Sophia cooked and tended to Emma, marveling at how quickly her daughter had taken to the stranger, reaching for him whenever he entered the room. On the third evening, as they sat before the stove drinking coffee laced with Patrick's whiskey, Sophia finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why a cowboy? You seem educated. Most drifters I've met can barely sign their names." Patrick's eyes crinkled at the corners. "My ma was a schoolteacher before she married, made sure all of us could read and cipher." He stared into his cup. "After she passed, the farm went too. Brothers and sisters got parceled out to relatives. I was 17, old enough to make my own way. And you chose the West." "Something about open country calls to a man," he said, his voice distant. "No fences, no limits, just you and what you can make of yourself." "It calls to women too," Sophia said softly. "Or at least it called to me. Thomas and I came out from Pennsylvania 3 years ago. Everyone said I was crazy to follow him to Wyoming territory." "Were you?" Patrick asked. "Crazy, I mean." Sophia looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully in the wooden cradle Patrick had repaired that afternoon. "Sometimes I think so, especially after Thomas died. But then—" She gestured around the cabin. "This is ours, our piece of America. I don't know if I can keep it, but I'm not ready to give up yet." Patrick nodded slowly. "What happened? To your husband? Trampled during a cattle drive. He was trying to build our herd." The words still hurt to say, but less sharply than before. "Emma was born a week later." "I'm sorry," Patrick said simply, and she knew he meant it. "The hardest part is knowing she'll never remember him," Sophia admitted. "And the loneliness. I never thought I'd miss simple conversation so much." Their eyes met across the small table, and Patrick reached out hesitantly, covering her hand with his. The touch was warm, solid, a human connection she hadn't realized she was starving for. "Reckon loneliness is the real killer out here," he said. "Not the weather or the work." Sophia nodded, surprised to find tears threatening. She withdrew her hand and busied herself with the coffee pot. "The storm should break tomorrow," she said, changing the subject. "You'll be able to make your way to Rawlins." Patrick's expression clouded. "Yes, I suppose so." That night, Sophia lay awake long after Patrick's breathing had deepened into sleep. The thought of returning to solitude after these few days of companionship felt unbearable. Yet what choice did she have? Patrick had a job waiting. He was a drifter. A cowboy. Men like him didn't settle, especially not for a widow with a baby and a failing homestead. Morning brought clear skies and brilliant sunlight that transformed the snow-covered landscape into a blinding white expanse. Patrick stood on the porch, squinting at the horizon while Sophia watched from the doorway, Emma bundled against her chest. "Trail should be passable by noon," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Yes," she agreed, her throat tight. "You could make good time." He turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Lawson, Sophia, He stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "I'm obliged for your hospitality." "And I for your help," she replied formally, though everything in her wanted to ask him to stay. Patrick nodded stiffly and moved to gather his things. The preparations for his departure were conducted in uncomfortable silence, so different from the easy companionship they'd shared over the previous days. As he saddled his horse in the lean-to, Sophia fought back tears. This was foolishness. She barely knew this man. Yet in 3 days, he'd become more important to her than anyone since Thomas. Patrick led his horse to the front of the cabin, tying the last of his saddlebags in place. When he turned to say goodbye, his face was a mask of forced neutrality. "If you're ever in Rawlins," he began awkwardly. "Yes, of course," Sophia interrupted, unable to bear platitudes. "Safe travels, Mr. Norris." He mounted his horse, looking down at her with that intense blue gaze. For a moment she thought he might say something more, but instead he simply tipped his hat. "Madam." "Little miss." He nodded at Emma, then turned his horse toward the trail. Sophia stood watching until he disappeared over the rise, the snow swallowing his figure. Only then did she allow herself to cry, silent tears freezing on her cheeks in the winter air. Life resumed its lonely rhythm. Sophia rationed the firewood Patrick had gathered, made the food he'd provided last as long as possible. Emma grew fussy, as if she too missed the cowboy's presence. Twice more that winter, storms hit, though none as severe as the blizzard that had brought Patrick to her door. Each time, Sophia used the techniques he'd taught her, finding fuel where she'd never thought to look before. February turned to March, and the first hints of spring began to appear. Snow melted, revealing patches of ground that had been hidden for months. Sophia ventured further from the cabin each day, assessing what remained of her homestead after the brutal winter. It was during one such inspection, Emma strapped to her back, that she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her hand went instinctively to the knife at her belt, another habit learned during her months alone. Squinting against the sun, she made out a rider coming from the direction of Rawlins. As the figure drew closer, her heart began to pound. She knew that silhouette, that way of sitting a horse. Patrick Norris, looking much the same as when he'd left, though perhaps better fed, he reined in a few yards away, studying her as if uncertain of his welcome. "Mrs. Lawson," he greeted, removing his hat. "Mr. Norris," she returned, unable to keep the smile from her face. "You're a long way from Rawlins." "That I am," he dismounted, leading his horse closer. "Thought I might check how you and the little one fared through the rest of winter." "We managed," Sophia said. "Thanks to your lessons." Patrick nodded, looking pleased, glad to hear it. His eyes roamed over the homestead, taking in the dilapidated barn, the fallow fields. "Planting season's coming." "Yes," Sophia acknowledged, the word heavy with implication. Without help, without capital for seed, her chances of sustaining the homestead another year were slim. Patrick cleared his throat. "Thing is, Mrs. Lawson, Sophia, I've been doing some thinking these past weeks." "Oh," she tried to keep her voice casual, though her pulse had quickened. Ranch work in Rawlins was fine enough, good pay, but... He looked around again, more deliberately this time, as if assessing potential rather than decay. A man gets to wondering what he's working toward, if he's building something or just passing time. Sophia waited, hardly daring to breathe. "I've saved most of my wages these past few years," Patrick continued. "Was aiming to buy my own spread someday, but starting from scratch in this territory takes more money than I've got." He met her eyes directly. "Unless a man found a partner, someone with land already." "Are you proposing a business arrangement, Mr. Norris?" Sophia asked carefully, though her heart hammered so loudly she was certain he must hear it. A flush crept up his neck. "Not exactly." He took a step closer. "Those 3 days in your cabin, they showed me something I'd been missing. Not just companionship, though Lord knows that was part of it." "What then?" she whispered. "Purpose," Patrick said simply. "Seeing you fight so hard for your girl, for this place, it made me want to be part of something that matters." He gestured at the homestead. "This land has potential. Good water, decent grazing, with work and some investment it could flourish." His eyes softened. "And that little one deserves a chance to grow up here where her father put down roots." Sophia felt tears threatening. "Patrick, are you saying—" "I'm saying I'd like to court you properly, Sophia Lawson," he interrupted, the words coming in a rush. "I know it's sudden, I know you're still grieving, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about you and Emma since I rode away." He took a deep breath. "I'm not asking for promises, just permission to try. To help with the spring planting, get this place on its feet, and see if what I felt growing between us might have a chance." Emma chose that moment to coo loudly from her carrier, reaching a tiny hand toward Patrick as if in approval. Despite her tears, Sophia laughed. "I think Emma's vote is clear," she said. She looked around at the homestead, her home, the dream she'd shared with Thomas, a dream that had been slipping away until a blizzard brought a stranger to her door. "As for me, I'd welcome the help, Patrick. And the company." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. "That's all I'm asking for, a chance." That spring, they worked side by side to resurrect the homestead. Patrick's savings purchased seed, chickens, and 2 milk cows. He repaired the barn and dug irrigation channels. Sophia planted a garden that promised vegetables for summer and fall. Together, They transformed the neglected property into a working farm. Their courtship progressed slowly, respectful of Sophia's widowhood and the memory of Thomas. Patrick spent his days at the homestead, but returned to lodgings in the nearest town, each evening a propriety that local gossips appreciated, though the ride added hours to his already long days. By midsummer, as the first crops ripened and the replenished herd of cattle grew fat on prairie grass, Sophia knew her heart had healed enough to love again. On a warm July evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies while Emma slept inside, she finally spoke the words they'd both been circling. "I think it's time you stopped riding back to town every night," she said quietly. Patrick turned to her, his expression cautious. "Are you certain?" Sophia reached for his hand. "I loved Thomas, I always will, but life is for the living and Emma needs a father." Her voice softened. "And I need a husband if you're still offering." Patrick didn't answer with words. Instead, he drew her into a gentle kiss, their first that spoke of promises, of futures, of dreams they would build together. They were married 2 weeks later by a circuit preacher who happened through the area. The ceremony was simple, attended only by a few neighbors and the station agent from town who had become Patrick's friend during his months of courting Sophia. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sophia stood nervously in the bedroom she had once shared with Thomas. Patrick entered quietly, carrying a small wooden box. "Wedding gift," he explained, placing it in her hands. Inside was a delicate silver locket. When opened, it revealed a tiny painting of Emma on one side, the other left empty. "For the next one," Patrick said softly, his meaning clear. "If you want that." Sophia closed the locket, emotion washing through her. "I do want that," she whispered, "very much." Their coming together that night was tender, unhurried, the union of two people who had found each other against all odds, who understood the precious fragility of happiness in a land that gave no guarantees. By the harvest, Sophia knew she was carrying Patrick's child. The homestead's first year under their joint care proved successful beyond their hopes, enough crops to see them through winter with surplus to sell, cattle healthy, repairs completed on all buildings. "We should give this place a proper name," Patrick suggested one evening as they sat before the same stove that had once gone cold on a desperate night. "Every real ranch needs a name." Sophia considered, one hand resting on her growing belly, the other stroking Emma's hair as the toddler played at their feet. "How about Phoenix Ranch?" she suggested. "Rising from the ashes like we have." Patrick smiled, reaching out to touch her cheek. "Perfect." Winter came again to Wyoming territory, but this time the stove burned warm through every storm. On the coldest nights, as wind rattled the reinforced walls of their cabin, Sophia would often think of that desperate evening when a half-frozen cowboy had appeared at her door, promising heat before sunrise. He had delivered that promise, and so many more she hadn't dared to dream of. Their son was born in early spring, a strong boy they named Thomas Patrick, honoring both the past and present. Emma, now 18 months old, approached her baby brother with solemn curiosity, placing gentle pats on his head as Sophia had taught her. "She'll be a good big sister," Patrick observed, watching the scene with pride. "She has good examples to follow," Sophia replied, leaning against her husband's solid warmth. As Phoenix Ranch flourished over the next years, so did their family. A second son, Michael, joined them 2 years after Thomas Patrick. The original cabin expanded to a proper ranch house with room for their growing brood. Sophia planted trees that would take decades to mature, a testament to their faith in the future of the home they were building. Each winter, on the anniversary of the blizzard that had brought them together, Patrick and Sophia would sit before the stove after the children were asleep, sharing the flask of whiskey he still carried in his saddlebags. "To cold stoves," he would toast with a wink. "And sunrise promises," she would answer, their private ritual of remembrance. In 1885, 7 years after Patrick had stumbled upon a widow's cabin in a blizzard, Phoenix Ranch hosted its first proper community gathering, a harvest celebration that brought neighbors from miles around. As lanterns glowed and fiddle music filled the autumn air, Sophia watched her husband teaching Emma, now 8, the steps to a simple dance. "You've built something remarkable here," said Eleanor Williams, wife of the nearest rancher. "When Thomas died, many of us feared you wouldn't survive that first winter." Sophia's eyes found Patrick across the yard, now swinging their youngest boy in circles while the child shrieked with delight. "I might not have," she admitted. "If not for a stray cowboy with a talent for finding firewood in a blizzard." "Providence," Eleanor pronounced with satisfaction. "The Lord provides." "Yes," Sophia agreed, "sometimes in the most unexpected ways." Later that night, after guests had departed and children were tucked into bed, Patrick found Sophia standing on the porch, gazing at the stars scattered across the Wyoming sky. "Happy?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. She leaned into his embrace. "More than I ever thought possible after Thomas died." She turned in his arms to face him. "Do you ever regret it, giving up the freedom of the trail for this?" Patrick's laugh was soft in the darkness. "Giving up loneliness for family, aimless wandering for purpose?" He kissed her forehead. "Not for a single moment. Even when the cattle break through fences or drought threatens or the children are all sick at once," she teased. "Even then." His voice grew serious. "What we've built here, Sophia, it's more than I ever dared hope for myself, a legacy, something that will outlast us." She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "That night you arrived, I was preparing myself to die," she confessed. "I thought Emma and I would freeze before morning." His arms tightened around her. "I've never told you, but I was lost long before that storm," Patrick said quietly. "Not just on the trail, but in life. Drifting, taking whatever work came my way, never putting down roots. When I saw your cabin, I was already half frozen. Another hour and—" He left the sentence unfinished. "We saved each other, I reckon." In the years that followed, Phoenix Ranch grew into one of the most prosperous in the county. Emma, their firstborn, developed her father's knack with horses and her mother's determination. The boys, Thomas, Patrick, and Michael, showed equal promise as they grew, one with cattle, the other with crops. When Emma turned 16, a young man from a neighboring ranch began calling with obvious intentions. Patrick watched these developments with the typical wariness of a father, while Sophia observed with knowing eyes. "She's too young," Patrick grumbled after one such visit. "She's the age I was when I met Thomas," Sophia reminded him gently. "The heart knows its own timing." Patrick sighed, running a hand through hair now threaded with silver. "I'm not ready to be a grandfather," Sophia laughed. "No one's talking about grandchildren yet," she patted his hand. "Besides, I'm not done having babies myself." His eyebrows shot up. "Sophia Norris, are you telling me?" She nodded, eyes sparkling. "Doctor confirmed it yesterday. Spring planting won't be the only new life this year." Patrick whooped with joy, lifting her off her feet despite her protests about her dignity. "12 years married and you still surprise me," he said when he finally set her down. "I plan to keep doing so for at least another 30 years, she promised. Their fourth child, a daughter they named Grace, arrived as predicted that spring, a joy to the entire family. Emma, far from resenting the attention the baby received, proved to be a second mother to her little sister. The turn of the century found Phoenix Ranch thriving beyond even Patrick and Sophia's ambitious dreams. Their cattle brand was known throughout Wyoming territory, their agricultural techniques studied by neighboring farms. Their children grew into capable adults who contributed to the family enterprise while developing their own interests and talents. Emma eventually married that persistent neighbor's son and established a horse breeding operation on adjoining land. Thomas Patrick took increasingly greater responsibility for the cattle business as Patrick eased into a less physically demanding role. Michael, the scholar of the family, returned from college in Denver with new ideas about crop rotation and soil management. And young Grace, showing her mother's intelligence and her father's charm, seemed destined for a future limited only by her considerable imagination. On a winter evening in 1903, 25 years after a desperate widow had opened her door to a half-frozen cowboy, Sophia and Patrick sat together on the porch of their ranch house. Despite the cold, they remained outside, wrapped in blankets, watching the sun set over land that had become the physical embodiment of their partnership. "Remember what you promised me that first night?" Sophia asked, her head resting on her husband's shoulder. "That you'd have heat before sunrise," Patrick recalled immediately. She smiled. "I've been thinking about that lately. It wasn't just the fire you brought back to that stove." No, Sophia said softly. "You brought heat back to my life, hope, a future when I thought mine was ending." She took his weathered hand in hers. 25 years of sunrises, each better than the last. Patrick's eyes, still that same clear blue despite the lines that now surrounded them, filled with emotion. "Best promise I ever made," he said gruffly. "Best one I ever kept." As darkness fell completely and the first stars appeared, they remained on the porch. Two people who had faced the wilderness together and transformed it, not just the physical landscape of their ranch, but the wilderness of grief and loneliness that had once threatened to consume them both. Inside the house, a lamp glowed in the window, marking home for anyone who might be traveling through the vastness of Wyoming. And at its heart, a stove burned steadily, its heat a testament to a promise made and a life built from the coldest of beginnings.